Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and remove that. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove all 4 of our 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of there, to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the wheel to the right because I'm working on the left side. And now at this point, we have a clear view of where our ABS sensor connects onto the hub. Now what we want to do is just remove this 10mm headed bolt right there, and then we're going to try to remove the sensor. Set that aside. All right, so now that we have the bolt out, it's going to be time to start removing the ABS sensor. Generally, these are going to be stuck inside the knuckle here. What you want to do is just basically just try to tap on it back and forth with some penetrant and see if you can get it to break free. This one kind of moves around a little bit, so I'm just going to grab onto it carefully and see if I can remove it. Okay. And now we can just inspect it. You want to make sure that it doesn't look like it's broken or damaged. Generally along this area right here, up along this cusp, is where you'll see a crack of some sort. This one looks really great, so we can carefully set this aside so we're not going to damage it in any way. Now let's go ahead and straighten this out a little bit. We'll move along to removing our axle nut. You're going to find that you have a cotter pin, a little locking castle up on here. We'll go ahead and remove those and remove the nut. Remove that. Now we'll use a 32mm socket to remove our axle nut. Hammer and a punch, come right in the center here, we'll break this free. Let's go ahead and turn this. Now the next thing we want to do is start removing the caliper bracket from the knuckle. You're going to find 2 mounting bolts for that right on the back. So from the back side here, you can find 2 19mm headed bolts. There's one right here, and there's one directly below it. Before I go ahead and take that off, I want to mention that we're going to be hanging our caliper. The reason why we're going to do that is because we don't want to go ahead and put a tug on our flex hose here and potentially damage it in any way. Let's go ahead and hang this from the strut, have it ready for us. We can remove these 2 bolts. We'll just take the caliper, put it right up here. Once you have that out, just go ahead and take it and put it in just a couple threads here just to hold it for us while we remove the second bolt. All set? Yep. There's our bolts. You just want to quickly inspect those, make sure they're still in usable condition. Hang that aside, grab onto that rotor, inspect it, set that aside as well. Now we want to take a peek behind here and we can find all 4 of our mounting bolts. We're going to have 2 on the forward side, 1 down low, 1 up higher, and then the same on the back. To access these, I always take the axle, I'll push it right on through as far as I can. I'll use my 17mm socket and a swivel and carefully start removing each of the bolts. Do the same to the rest. All right, at this point, we have all of our mounting bolts out of here. We're just gonna go ahead and take this axle nut. We'll start it on here a couple threads. It's kind of like a safety nut. Now what we need to do is go ahead and remove the bearing from the knuckle. To do that, I'm gonna use my hammer. I'm gonna give this a couple loving bonks in pretty much every direction that I can. Try to break it free from the knuckle. We have this on here just in case it does break free. I don't want it to come flying off and potentially hurt anybody. Remove that backing plate. There's our bearing. Okay, so now that we have the bearing out of there, the next thing that we want to do is start cleaning down this area. Of course, we have the knuckle, which we'll talk about in a second, but firstly, we're going to talk about the axle. On the axle, you have these splines, which is where essentially it's supposed to go into the bearing. You want to inspect these. You want to make sure it doesn't look like they're rotted or starting to deteriorate in any way. If these are rotted and weak, your axle could potentially spin inside the wheel bearing, in which case you're going to have drivability issues. Let's go ahead and clean this down. Try to clean out anything that might be inside these splines here. Then once you feel as though you have that cleaned up pretty well, we'll continue on to doing the same thing to the knuckle. You want to make sure you clean the entire inner portion here. Get all along this area. Once you have all that cleaned, let's continue on to the outer portion here, which is where the bearing is going to be pressed up against. You want to make sure you have all the debris off this area. If you leave anything on there, it creates a possibility where the bearing's not going to sit flush up against here. You might end up having alignment problems. You might also have an issue where the bearing loosens up on you because it couldn't tighten up properly, or you might even have grounding problems. So I'm just going to go ahead and sand that down. Let's hit it with some parts cleaner. Let that dry. While we have that doing its job, let's continue on to cleaning up the backing plate here. You can see exactly where the bearing was riding, but essentially I just want to make sure any of these large flakes are completely out of the area. I don't want anything falling in between the bearing and the knuckle itself. Just going to fully inspect this side. Once you're sure one side looks good, go ahead and do the same to the other. Okay. Once you have all that cleaned up, let's continue with our cleaning. We have our 4 mounting bolts for the wheel bearing, and then the 2 bolts right here that were for that brake caliper bracket. You want to inspect these. You want to make sure that the threading is perfect on them. If it looks like they're a little rotted, you're probably going to want to replace it. For ours in particular, we just have a tiny bit of rust. So I'm going to take them to the wire wheel. I'll get them nice and cleaned up. Then we'll apply some red thread locker, and we can get ready for our install. All right, so I've got these cleaned and prepped. Let's continue on with some copper never sees. The areas that we want to use copper never sees are on the splined areas here, not necessarily the threaded area of the axle, just the splines. And then, of course, the area that we cleaned up inside the knuckle area. We've got all this area that's a circle, and then along the outer portion. You don't necessarily need to try to get into any of these holes right here because that's where the bolts are going to come through. Okay, so now we can get ready for our install. Let's go ahead and take our fully cleaned backing plate here. We're just going to put it in this position. You can see that I have this entire flat area out and towards where the tie rod end is. If you have it like this or even like that, it's just really not going to work properly. Let's go ahead and put it in position. We'll grab our brand new bearing. We're going to slide this in here. Should want to slide right into that knuckle there and over the axle. There we are. Get everything lined up. We have to line up the holes of the knuckle, the backing plate, and the bearing. Once everything's lined up, go ahead and start your bolts in through the back. Once all 4 of them are started, we can go ahead and snug them up, and then we'll torque them to manufacturer specifications. Let's go ahead and get this bolt in here. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get them started. That's the importance of starting them all before you snug them up. At this point, I'm ready to start torquing these bolts to 44 foot-pounds. I'll go ahead and get my socket on here. There's that one. Now we can move along to applying some copper never sees to our mating surface of our bearing. Now we need to pay attention to the backside of our rotor. This is the area that's going to be pressed right up against that wheel bearing. It's very common for there to be a lot of rust buildup on this. If that's the case, use some sandpaper or whatever you have. Make sure you scuff it up so it's clean. Ours just has a little bit of debris, so I'll spray it down. Once you're sure that it's clean and free of any debris, just go ahead and let that dry. We'll go ahead and put that up onto the vehicle. Now at this point, I always just take one of my lug nuts. I'm going to start it on there to hold the rotor for me. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and turn this and we can start remounting our caliper. At this point, we can go ahead and take our caliper. We're going to slide it right over the rotor here. We'll get it in position. Start in both of our mounting bolts with, of course, the red thread locker on them. Once they're both started, you can bottom them out, and then we're going to torque each of these to 122 foot-pounds. All right, those are torqued. Double check everything. Make sure you didn't twist your flex hose right here. If you did, of course, you're going to want to remove the caliper, just untwist it and replace it. This looks pretty great. Let's move along. Time to reinstall the ABS sensor. Let's go ahead and line it up with the corresponding hole. We also have our mounting bolt for this. Make sure that's lined up as well. We'll start this in, snug it up, and then we're going to torque this to 7 foot-pounds. That's not very much. Plenty of access. Let's go ahead and put on all of these lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and we can start torquing everything. Now that we've got the wheel back on the ground so this can't spin on us, let's go ahead and torque the axle nut to 92 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and put this on. What you want to pay attention to is the little slots that you have on it. You want to try to get them lined up with the hole that's inside the axle here. That's how we're going to lock it in with a lock and cotter pin. Let's try to pin this over. There we are, so we can't loosen up on us while we're driving down the road. And now we'll torque each of our lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. You just want to line up your valve stem hole. Give that a couple bonks. Make sure it's secure so it doesn't fall off while you're driving down the road. Okay, friends, we got the car back together. Now, we installed that ABS sensor, so of course, if you had an ABS light, you're going to want to make sure you clear it. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test. Make sure that ABS light doesn't come back on. Assuming that's good, you should be good to go. Thanks for watching.